Good evening, my friends. Welcome to the Bedtime Bard, home to gentle stories for the late hours. Tonight, let's turn to one of the most enduring landscapes of the ancient world, Greece. A place of islands and stone, sea winds and city walls, where questions were treated almost like a craft. When you think of ancient Greece, what images come to mind? Perhaps marble temples gleaming under a Mediterranean sun, philosophers in flowing robes deep in debate, or tales of gods and heroes on Mount Olympus. Ancient Greece feels familiar. It gave us the word democracy and the epics of Homer. Yet it was a world very different from our own. It was not a single unified empire, but a collection of independent city-states, each with its own customs and spirit. Over more than a millennium, these small communities produced extraordinary achievements in art, politics, and thought. We will journey through the history of ancient Greece, exploring how a rugged land of farmers and sailors became the cradle of Western civilization. We'll begin by setting the stage with the land itself, the geography that shaped Greek history. Ancient Greece occupied a mountainous peninsula and countless islands at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. The landscape was dramatic, rocky peaks cutting into fertile valleys, and an indented coastline with clear blue seas. Mountains cover roughly 80% of Greece's land. This terrain naturally divided Greece into isolated regions, making travel on land difficult. As a result, ancient Greek communities grew up separated by mountains and sea, fostering independent city-states rather than one centralized kingdom. Each valley or island might shelter its own polis, city-state, and over time, more than 1,000 would emerge, each with its own laws and traditions. No matter where someone lived in Greece, they were never far from the sea, like frogs around a pond, as the philosopher Plato once said of his people. The Aegean and Ionian seas were the highways of the ancient Greeks. With few wide rivers and only small plains for farming, the Greeks turned to the sea for food and trade. Olive groves and grapevines thrived on the hillsides, but grain was scarce, so ships carried wheat from Egypt and fish from the Black Sea in exchange for Greek olive oil and pottery. The Mediterranean climate of hot, dry summers and mild, wetter winters shaped the rhythms of life. Farmers planted in autumn and harvested in spring. Summer was a time for tending vines, sailing ships, and attending religious festivals. Geography also offered the Greeks some protection and identity. The rugged land made large-scale invasion difficult, and the coastline's many natural harbors invited seafaring. At the same time, living in small isolated pockets encouraged fierce local pride. Each city-state saw itself as a distinct community, even though they shared language and gods. Yet the Greeks did unite in certain ways. They all honored Mount Olympus as the highest peak and mythical home of the gods, and they met together for events like the Olympic Games. In short, the land of Greece, divided by mountains, bounded by sea, set the stage for a uniquely fragmented but vibrant civilization. With this setting in mind, let us turn to the earliest chapters of Greek history, in the ancient Aegean, before the rise of the famous city-states. Long before the days of Socrates or the Parthenon, the seeds of Greek civilization were sown in the Aegean Sea. In the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, more than 4,000 years ago, a series of remarkable cultures flourished around the Aegean, laying foundations for later Greek life. These include the Cycladic culture of the Greek islands, the Minoan civilization on Crete, and the Mycenaean civilization on mainland Greece. Though these peoples lived before classical Greece, their achievements and mysteries are an essential prologue to Greek history. The earliest of these was the Cycladic culture, named for the Cyclades, a ring of islands in the southern Aegean. By around 3000 BC, seafaring farming communities on these islands were developing distinctive arts. The Cycladic people are best known for their elegant marble figurines, stylized human figures, often abstract female forms carved in white stone. These figurines, found in ancient island graves, captivate modern viewers with their minimalist beauty and have become icons of early Aegean art. The Cycladic islanders were skilled sailors and traders. Archaeologists have found Cycladic pottery in Crete and mainland Greece, showing that even at this early date, the Aegean Sea linked far-flung communities. By around 2000 BC, however, the Cycladic culture began to be eclipsed by a rising power to the south, the brilliant civilization emerging on Crete. The Minoan civilization blossomed on the large island of Crete and is often celebrated as Europe's first advanced civilization. Flourishing roughly from 2000 BC to 1400 BC, the Minoans built a wealthy, vibrant society centered on grand palace complexes. The very name Minoan is modern, coined by archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans after the legendary King Minos of Crete. It hints at the mythical aura of this culture, which later Greeks remembered dimly in legends of the Labyrinth and the Minotaur. At Knossos, Phaistos, and other sites on Crete, the Minoans constructed sprawling palaces, unlike anything seen before in Europe. These were not exactly royal residences, but multi-purpose centers of administration, storage, and ritual. The most famous is Knossos, often called the Palace of Minos, which Evans excavated in the early 1900s. Knossos revealed a complex of dozens of rooms around a central court, with intricate staircases, colorful frescoes on the walls, and advanced features like drainage systems. Walking through its remains today, one can imagine how the legend of the labyrinth, the maze that housed the Minotaur, might have originated from the palace's maze-like layout. Minoan Crete was prosperous and outward-looking. The Minoans were master traders and sailors. Surrounded by the sea, they established trade links across the Mediterranean, with Egypt, the Near East, and the Greek mainland. Cargo ships carried Cretan olive oil, wine, and crafted goods abroad, and brought back metals and luxury materials. Minoan artisans produced splendid works, delicate jewelry, fine ceramics, and the famous Minoan frescoes that still astonish us with their lively scenes. One well-known fresco from Knossos shows a daring ritual of bull leaping, young acrobats vaulting over a charging bull, perhaps a religious ceremony or sport. This image of athletic grace and the sacred bull captures something essential about Minoan culture. It was energetic, nature-loving, and maybe even ecstatic in its art. Religion and society in Minoan Crete remain somewhat mysterious. The Minoans left written records, but we cannot fully read them. Their script, known as Linear A, has never been deciphered. From their art and artifacts, it appears they worshipped goddesses or a great goddess figure and conducted rituals at hilltop shrines and in caves. Notably, unlike contemporary Egyptians or Mesopotamians, the Minoans did not glorify warrior kings in their art. We see no clear depictions of monarchs or battles. This suggests their political organization might have been different, possibly more cooperative or theocratic, though the details are lost to time. What we do know is that Minoan society was stable and flourishing for many centuries allowing art and technology to reach impressive heights. They even developed writing systems, Cretan hieroglyphs and later Linear A, for economic record-keeping. The Minoan language remains unknown, a reminder of how this culture still keeps some secrets. The decline of the Minoans is as fascinating as their rise. Around 1600 BC, a cataclysmic volcanic eruption occurred on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, to the north of Crete. This was one of the most powerful eruptions in recorded history, and it likely caused massive tsunamis and climate disruptions in the region. Some scholars believe this disaster gravely weakened Minoan Crete, possibly inspiring the myth of Atlantis, although the exact timing and effects are debated. What is clear is that by 1450 BC, many of the Minoan palaces were destroyed or abandoned. In the aftermath, Crete appears to have been taken over by outsiders, the Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. The Mycenaeans adopted the Minoan palatial centers and even modified the writing system, Linear A, into Linear B to record their own Greek language. Minoan civilization gradually faded into a hybrid Minoan-Mycenaean culture, which lasted until around 1100 BC. Centuries later, the glory of Minoan Crete was forgotten until modern archaeology rediscovered it. Thanks to excavations and the decipherment of Linear B in 1952, we now recognize the Minoans as a brilliant cornerstone of Greek heritage, a Bronze Age civilization of vibrant art, commerce, and innovation, the first light of civilization in Europe. On the Greek mainland, another civilization was rising even as the Minoans thrived on Crete. This was the world of the Mycenaeans, named after Mycenae, one of their chief cities. The Mycenaean civilization is often considered the first truly Greek civilization because the Mycenaeans spoke an early form of the Greek language. In contrast to the peaceful images of Minoan art, the Mycenaeans were a more overtly warlike and aristocratic society. They built fortified citadels on hilltops, filled their tombs with weapons and gold, and left us legends of warrior kings and epic battles. These are the Achaeans, celebrated in Homer's epics, the heroes of the Iliad and Odyssey, though separating myth from reality is challenging. Mycenaean Greece emerged around 1600 BC, likely influenced by earlier Minoan and local Helladic cultures. Over the next centuries, powerful kingdoms took shape in places like Mycenae, Pylos, Thebes, and Tiryns on the mainland. Each was ruled by a king. In later Greek memory, leaders like Agamemnon of Mycenae or Nestor of Pylos, and supported by a hierarchy of nobles and officials. The Mycenaeans built palaces too, but their palaces were different from the open, labyrinthine Minoan complexes. A Mycenaean palace, such as the one excavated at Pylos, centered on a megaron, a grand hall with a hearth, likely the throne room of the king. Around 1250 BC, the Mycenaeans fortified their citadels with massive stone walls, so huge that later Greeks called them Cyclopean, as if built by giants. The famous Lion Gate of Mycenae, with its relief of two lions, still stands as an emblem of Mycenaean power. Materially, the Mycenaeans were both warriors and traders. Rich grave circles at Mycenae, dating to around 1600 to 1500 BC, have yielded astonishing treasures. Gold funeral masks, weapons inlaid with scenes of lions hunting, and ornate cups. One gold mask from a Mycenaean shaft grave was so striking it was dubbed the Mask of Agamemnon by its discoverer, Heinrich Schliemann, though it predates the legendary Agamemnon by centuries. These finds suggest a warrior aristocracy that celebrated martial valor and wealth. At the same time, Linear B clay tablets, baked hard by accidental fires, reveal detailed records of palace administration, inventories of grain, wine, livestock, and allocations of bronze. They show that the Mycenaean palatial economy was highly organized, redistributing goods and commanding craft production, for example, chariots and armor. Mycenaean craftsmen and merchants maintained trade networks that reached Italy, Egypt, and Anatolia, inheriting and expanding the Minoans' commercial links. Culturally and religiously, the Mycenaeans adopted many elements from the Minoans, such as art styles and the worship of some gods, but they also had their own contributions. The linear B tablets from Pylos and Knossos, after the Mycenaean takeover of Crete, even record names of gods familiar from later Greek religion. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and Dionysus appear in these earliest Greek writings, showing that the Olympian gods were already worshipped in Bronze Age Greece. The Mycenaeans likely spoke prayers to Zeus on their citadel heights and offered sacrifice at peak sanctuaries, blending their warrior culture with deep-set religious traditions. One of the most enduring legacies of the Mycenaeans is the oral poetry that would much later be written down as Homer's epics. The tales of the Trojan War, of Achilles' wrath and Odysseus' wanderings, are set in a world that closely resembles Mycenaean Greece, even though Homer composed them centuries afterward. It seems that memories and myths of the Mycenaeans' exploits survived the ages. Indeed, some historians speculate that there were real conflicts between Mycenaean Greeks and powers in Anatolia around 1200 BC that could be the kernel of truth behind the Trojan War legend. Hittite records from that era mention a people called Ahiyawa, possibly the Achaeans, active in western Anatolia, hinting that the Homeric saga may echo distant historical events. By around 1200 BC, however, the glory of the Mycenaeans came to an abrupt and dramatic end. In a span of 1 or 2 generations, nearly all the Mycenaean palaces were destroyed or abandoned. The reasons for this Bronze Age collapse remain partly mysterious. Archaeological evidence shows widespread destruction by fire at palace sites, and after about 1100 BC, the linear B writing disappears completely. Historians have proposed various and possibly interconnected causes: internal uprisings, invasions by outsiders, like the semi-legendary Dorians, earthquakes, famine, and the disruption of trade networks by the turmoil of the sea peoples who ravaged the eastern Mediterranean around that time. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia and the New Kingdom of Egypt also suffered great shocks around 1200 BC, suggesting a regional systemic collapse. One plausible scenario is that the palatial system of the Mycenaeans, which concentrated wealth and depended on long-distance trade for bronze and food, became vulnerable to any shock. Once a few centers fell, the whole interconnected system unraveled. As a result, Greece entered a dark age. Population declined, cities were abandoned, and the art of writing was lost for several centuries. The grand stone palaces and fine goldwork of Mycenae faded into legend. Greek storytellers in later ages would look back on that lost age of heroes with both awe and puzzlement, spinning it into the epic mythology we know. Thus, by 1100 BC or so, ancient Greece had fallen asleep, culturally speaking. But this wasn't the end, merely an interval of transformation. We now enter the period aptly called the Greek Dark Ages, when the lights of civilization burned low but did not go out. From around 1200 BC to 800 BC, Greece went through a period of relative obscurity and simplicity, known as the Greek Dark Ages. The term dark refers not only to the shadow of hardship that fell over the land, but also to our lack of written records from this time. With the collapse of the Mycenaean palace system, the linear B writing system vanished, and for centuries, the Greeks left no written documents at all. What happened during these 4 centuries of darkness? Archaeology paints a picture of a much simpler, poorer society after 1200 BC. The great stone citadels and monumental palaces were gone. No new ones were built once the old ones fell. In many areas, people abandoned the older settlements and lived in smaller, scattered villages. Trade greatly diminished, as evidenced by far fewer imported goods. The finely crafted Mycenaean pottery gave way to plainer styles. Burial customs changed too. Elaborate shaft graves and tholos tombs were replaced by simpler cemeteries. Cremation became common in some regions, like Athens, while inhumation persisted in others. All these signs point to a shrinking population and a breakdown of central authority. The complex bureaucracy of the Mycenaean palaces, with their record-keeping of stores and rations, was no more. As one historian summarized, the collapse of the political and economic system centered on the Mycenaean palaces provoked a climate of instability and insecurity. People likely moved around in search of safety or sustenance, and some even left Greece entirely. However, life went on for the Greeks in these dark centuries, albeit on a smaller scale. The basic tasks of farming, herding, and crafting continued as they had for millennia. Without palaces to patronize large workshops, crafts became local. Pottery styles, for example, became regionally distinct and generally simpler, evolving through the proto-geometric to geometric styles in art. Ironworking was introduced, marking the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Iron tools and weapons slowly spread, giving even modest villages access to metal for plows or swords that earlier might have been monopolized by an elite. In a sense, technology democratized to a degree. By 900 BC, iron had largely replaced bronze for weapons, meaning a wider portion of the population could arm themselves. The economy was likely more pastoral and subsistence-based. Without large-scale trade, communities had to be self-sufficient, farming their ancestral plots. Later, Greeks called these family plots the kleros, which in Dark Age times would have been the key to survival. Socially, the Dark Ages saw simpler forms of community organization. Instead of kings ruling over vast territories, leadership might have fallen to local chieftains or big men who gained influence through personal charisma and prowess. In some places, like Lefkandi in Euboea, archaeologists have found evidence of a chieftain's house or a ceremonial building from around 950 BC, showing that even in the Dark Age, some social hierarchy and wealth existed. Lefkandi, in fact, provides a fascinating glimpse. A large building there contained rich grave offerings from around 1000 BC, suggesting a local leader of considerable status, even as overall Greek society was poorer. We might imagine many villages had their leading families or warriors, but no one had the power or resources to dominate large regions for long. One major development in the Dark Ages was the movement and resettlement of Greek peoples. The later Greeks believed that a Dorian invasion occurred. Newcomers, the Dorians, entering from the north and settling in regions like Sparta and Crete. While the reality of a single invasion is uncertain, it's clear that populations shifted. Some Mycenaean Greeks from the collapse era seem to have migrated eastward. By the 900s BC, we find Greek-speaking communities established on the coast of Anatolia, modern Turkey, which is why those later regions had Greek cities like Miletus and Ephesus. Legends like the flight of sons of Heracles to Dorian lands, or Ionian colonization of Asia Minor, likely reflect these post-Mycenaean movements. In Cyprus, too, around 1100 BC, evidence shows the arrival of Greek settlers. Greek pottery styles and later Greek dialect on Cyprus suggest this. So, the Greek world's geography was being reshaped. By the end of the Dark Age, Greeks were not only in mainland Greece and the Aegean islands, but firmly planted on the western coast of Asia Minor. This diaspora would be significant in the centuries to come. Culturally, the oral tradition kept memories and myths of the past alive during the Dark Age. This was the era when wandering bards presumably refined the epic stories that would later be attributed to Homer. By the 8th century BC, as the Dark Period waned, these oral poems took the form of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The epics portray a heroic age with palaces and great kings, likely a romanticized memory of Mycenaean times passed down over generations in song. Thus, even without writing, the Greeks of the Dark Age preserved a connection to their past and a rich store of mythology that would unite them culturally. By 800 BC, Greece was already stirring from its long sleep. Population began to grow again, settlements expanded, and, crucially, the Greeks reinvented writing. They borrowed the idea of an alphabet from the Phoenicians, a seafaring Semitic people, and around the 8th century BC created the Greek alphabet, adding vowels to the Phoenician letters. This development, occurring by perhaps 750 BC, marks the end of the Dark Ages and the start of a new epoch, the Archaic period. With writing, the Greeks could now record poems, inscribe laws, and preserve transactions. The historical era of Greece was about to dawn. It's as if the lights were gradually coming back on. In summary, the Greek Dark Ages were a time of contraction and change. The high culture of Mycenae diminished, but the Greeks adapted and survived. Out of the poverty and isolation of those centuries, new social forms emerged that set the stage for the explosion of Greek civilization that was to follow. Small communities governed by local chiefs would evolve into the city-states that define Greek history. Iron tools and weapons gave the ordinary farmer-soldier a new importance. And the heroic legends and religious practices incubated in those dark years would flourish in the sunlight of the archaic and classical periods. Let us now turn to that rebirth, the rise of the polis, the city-state, which is the hallmark of Greek life. Around the 8th century BC, Greece underwent a dramatic transformation. This period, known as the Archaic period, 800 to 500 BC, saw the rise of the polis, the city-state, as the dominant form of social and political organization. A polis was more than just a city. It was a community of citizens, with its surrounding countryside, who were self-governing and independent. Names like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes all originally referred to Polis. The emergence of these city-states was a gradual process, rooted in the recovery after the Dark Ages, and shaped by Greece's geography and past. As we have noted, the fragmentation of the land and the absence of a powerful central authority after the Mycenaean collapse paved the way for small local units to thrive. By 750 BC, these units coalesced into towns with markets, walls, temples, and distinctive identities. Greece became a land of many small worlds, often competitive, sometimes cooperative, always proud. Several interwoven developments marked the archaic rise of the polis. Population growth and urbanization. After centuries of stagnation, the Greek population began to increase around the 9th to 8th centuries BC. Villages grew larger, and some fused together to form towns. With more people came social complexity, specialization of labor, the emergence of artisans and merchants, and the need for new political arrangements. In many places, the old tribal or clan leadership gave way to broader governance structures. Leading families might still hold sway, but assemblies of male citizens began to have a voice, setting the stage for later experiments with oligarchy and democracy. The poet Hesiod, writing around 700 BC, gives us a glimpse of a farmer's life in this era. 1 foot still in subsistence farming, but aware of justice and the role of leaders in the community. Economic revival and trade. The Archaic Age was a time of economic expansion. Greeks reconnected with the wider Mediterranean, trading and adventuring abroad. One of the first signs of revival was the appearance of Greek pottery with geometric designs, hence the term geometric period, which by the 8th century BC was being exported far and wide. Soon, Greek merchants were sailing regularly to Egypt and the Levant again. With trade came wealth for certain cities, and also the introduction of new ideas. For instance, the Greeks learned about coinage from their contacts in Anatolia, and by the late 7th century BC, many Greek city-states were minting their first coins. Coinage revolutionized the economy, facilitating commerce and also empowering common citizens, as wages could be paid in coin. The use of an alphabet to write Greek, adapted from Phoenician by about 800 BC, was another game changer. It enabled record-keeping and perhaps helped in codifying laws. Colonization. One extraordinary phenomenon of the Archaic Age is the Greek colonization movement. Between roughly 750 and 600 BC, Greek city-states sent out hundreds of colonies across the Mediterranean and Black Sea coasts. The reasons varied. Population pressure, hunger for arable land, the search for metals and trade opportunities, or internal strife that led a faction to seek new horizons. Whatever the motives, the result was an expansion of the Greek world, from Spain in the west to the Caucasus in the east. Greek colonies appeared in Sicily and southern Italy, in the northern Aegean and Thrace, along the Black Sea shores, and in North Africa. These colonies were independent polis in their own right, though they often maintained ties of kinship and religion with their mother cities. This colonization not only spread Greek culture far and wide, but also brought the Greeks into direct contact, and sometimes conflict, with other peoples, Etruscans, Carthaginians, Scythians, Egyptians, and more, enriching their experience and knowledge of the world. Social and political evolution. As Polis grew, they faced new social tensions. Wealth from trade created an emergent merchant class that wanted a say in politics, challenging old aristocracies. In many city-states, the 7th and 6th centuries BC saw the rise of tyrants. Not tyrants in the modern sense of cruel dictators, but in Greek usage, sole rulers who often seized power unconstitutionally. These tyrants in archaic Greece often had popular support at first. Typically, they were ambitious nobles or wealthy commoners who overthrew oligarchic councils and ruled as one-man regimes. For example, Cypselus became tyrant of Corinth around 657 BC and ushered in a prosperous, if autocratic, era. Tyrants also ruled in places like Samos, Miletus, and Athens. Athens had a famous tyrant, Pisistratus, in the 6th century BC. Many of these tyrannies were relatively short-lived, lasting a few generations at most, but they often helped break the stranglehold of aristocrats and set the stage for broader civic participation once the tyrants fell. During this time, new political ideas were taking root. The concept of citizenship, that free male inhabitants of a polis had both rights and duties, developed. While far from today's democratic equality, women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded. This was a novel idea in the ancient world. The state was a community of citizens, not the possession of a king. In some cities, particularly Athens, these ideas evolved dramatically toward democracy, as we will explore. In others, like Sparta, they took a different shape, emphasizing a rigid military oligarchy. But the essential unit in every case was the polis, a community with its own laws, deities, and customs. A major unifying factor among all Greeks in this era was Pan-Hellenism, the sense of shared Greek identity. Even as city-states often feuded, they recognized each other as fellow Hellenes, Greeks, in contrast to non-Greek barbarians. Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries and games fostered this unity. The most famous example is the Olympic Games, traditionally dated as first held in 776 BC in Olympia, in honor of Zeus. Every 4 years, Greeks from many cities would travel to Olympia to compete in athletic contests and honor the king of the gods. During the Games, an Olympic truce was declared so athletes and spectators could travel safely. Victors won only olive wreaths, but eternal glory for themselves and prestige for their hometowns. Similarly, the Oracle of Delphi, where the priestess of Apollo delivered cryptic prophecies, became a pan-Hellenic institution. Cities and individuals consulted Delphi on matters of war, colonization, and religion. These shared institutions, along with the epics of Homer and the worship of the Olympian gods, wove a cultural fabric that all Greeks participated in, despite their political fragmentation. By the end of the Archaic period, 500 BC, Greece was a mosaic of city-states large and small, each fiercely independent, yet culturally Greek. Some polis had grown quite large. Athens and Syracuse, for example, had tens of thousands of inhabitants. Political systems ranged from Sparta's mixed oligarchy, 2 kings and a council of elders, to Athens' early democracy. There were also federations like the Peloponnesian League led by Sparta, and the idea of forming alliances between city-states was taking hold. All these changes set the stage for the next chapter, the clash with a foreign superpower, the Persian Empire, and the ensuing classical golden age of Greece. But before we reach the epoch of Pericles and Socrates, we should look more closely at 2 particular city-states that came to exemplify Greek ideals in contrasting ways: Athens and Sparta. Among all the Greek city-states, Athens holds a special place in history. It was a vibrant center of art, learning, and democratic governance, a city whose cultural achievements in the 5th century BC became a foundation of Western civilization. But Athens' story begins long before its golden age. How did this city, located in the region of Attica, evolve from a modest Mycenaean settlement to the birthplace of democracy and philosophy? In the Archaic period, Athens underwent a series of political reforms that gradually empowered its citizens. Early Athens was ruled by kings in the mythical past. Legends speak of King Theseus uniting Attica. By the Archaic Age, power had shifted to an aristocracy of noble families. Ordinary people, small farmers, craftsmen, had little say and often fell into debt bondage. Social strains grew severe by the 7th century BC, nearly sparking revolution. Into this crisis stepped Solon, a wise statesman appointed in 594 BC to reform the laws and heal the city's woes. Solon famously canceled heavy debts and freed many Athenians who had been enslaved for debt. He reorganized the citizens into 4 classes based on wealth, allowing even commoners to participate in the assembly and courts, though top offices were still reserved for the wealthy. Solon's reforms didn't create democracy outright, but they laid its groundwork by acknowledging the broader citizenry. Athens had its period of tyranny too. In the 6th century BC, Pisistratus seized power after a couple of failed attempts and became tyrant of Athens. He and his sons ruled for several decades. Under Pisistratus, Athens actually prospered. He promoted the arts and religion, inaugurating festivals like the city Dionysia, where drama would later flourish, and undertaking public works. However, his son Hippias grew harsh, and in 510 BC, the tyrants were overthrown with a push from other aristocrats and help from Sparta. Power then fell to Cleisthenes, who in 508 BC carried out a sweeping democratic reform. Cleisthenes broke the power of traditional noble factions by reorganizing Attica into new tribes and local units, mixing people from city, coast, and inland. He created the Council of 500 with representatives from all over Attica and gave the assembly of all male citizens the final say in laws. This is often considered the true birth of Athenian democracy. Thereafter, Athens was governed by the collective decisions of its citizens, albeit citizens defined as free adult men. Offices were often filled by lot to ensure fairness, and any citizen could speak in the assembly. This system was radical for its time. As one Athenian of a later generation, Pericles, proudly declared, Athens' constitution was a model where power was in the hands not of a few, but of the many. Culturally, even before its golden age, Athens was distinguished. It became a center for pottery and craftsmanship in the 6th century. Attic painted vases were exported widely. The city patronized poets and thinkers. By the 5th century, Athens had surpassed other cities in wealth and influence, especially after its pivotal role in the Persian Wars, which we will detail soon. In the half-century following those wars, Athens entered a period of remarkable achievement. Statesman Pericles led Athens during much of this time, fostering democracy at home and building an empire abroad through the Delian League, initially an alliance against Persia that Athens converted into its own Aegean empire. The city's skyline was transformed. The Parthenon, a magnificent marble temple to Athena, was built on the Acropolis under Pericles' direction. Athens bustled with philosophers, dramatists, and artisans. The theater of Dionysus saw the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and the comedies of Aristophanes. In the Agora, marketplace, you might find Socrates engaging in debate, or sophists teaching rhetoric to youths. The Parthenon on the Acropolis of Athens, built in the 5th century BC, is one of the most representative symbols of the cultural sophistication of the ancient Greeks. It stands as a testament to Athens' golden age, when art, architecture, and public life flourished under democratic ideals. Daily life in Athens was dynamic. Citizens gathered in the assembly on the Nix Hill to debate policy, an extraordinary exercise in self-government for the time. They also spent mornings in the gymnasiums or at symposia, drinking parties, discussing everything from politics to poetry. Athenian society had its inequalities. Women from citizen families were largely confined to domestic life, managing the home and raising children, and could not participate in politics. Slavery was common. Many households had slaves, and they worked in tasks ranging from household servants to skilled laborers in workshops or as rowers in the fleet. But even with these limitations, Athens produced an atmosphere of intellectual freedom that was unparalleled. Foreigners came to Athens for opportunity, adding to the cosmopolitan feel. The city prided itself on being open and a school for all of Greece, as Pericles famously said in his funeral oration. Athens's story, however, is not just one of internal glory. It also involved conflict, especially with its great rival, Sparta, and eventually tragedy in the Peloponnesian War. We will come to those events later. For now, we have in Athens a picture of a city-state that championed freedom for its citizens, education, and cultural brilliance. It combined a naval commercial power with a passion for new ideas. This combination would drive the Greek world forward in the classical period. But first, let's look at the other side of the coin. Sparta, Athens' foil in so many ways, yet equally fascinating. If Athens was the school of Greece, Sparta was its army camp. Renowned for its military prowess and austere lifestyle, Sparta stands out as one of history's most unique societies. The very name Sparta evokes images of disciplined phalanxes, fearless warriors, and the sacrifice at Thermopylae. But what was life really like in this strange city-state? To the Greeks, Sparta was both admired and puzzling, a society that chose to live under rigorously strict laws and customs, all to preserve a formidable military machine. Sparta was located in the region of Laconia in the southern Peloponnese. By the Archaic period, the Spartans had conquered their neighbors, the Mycenaeans, in brutal wars, 8th to 7th centuries BC. They turned the Mycenaeans into helots, a servile class of state-owned serfs who farmed the land and fed the Spartan state. This exploitation made Sparta rich in resources, but it also meant the Spartans lived perpetually on guard against helot revolts. The helots far outnumbered the Spartan citizens. To maintain control, Sparta developed its famously harsh system of military training and social control. Legend credits Lycurgus, a semi-mythical lawgiver, with founding the Spartan system. The Spartans themselves believed Lycurgus received the laws from the Oracle of Delphi, whether or not one man did it. By about 600 BC, Sparta's institutions were set. They had a mixed constitution. 2 kings, hereditary monarchs from 2 families, who led in war and performed priestly roles, a council of elders of 28 men over age 60 who proposed laws, and an assembly of all male citizens who could approve or reject proposals. Uniquely, Sparta also had 5 ephors, overseers, elected annually, who held great power, including over kings. This system balanced monarchy, oligarchy, and limited democracy in a way that much impressed later political theorists like Plato and Aristotle. But real power in Sparta lay in the tight-knit elite of full citizens, all of whom were expected to be professional soldiers. Spartan society was essentially a military fraternity. From birth, a Spartan was evaluated for strength. Weak infants were said to be exposed, left to die. At age 7, boys were taken from their families and enrolled in the Aegean, the state-run education and training program. In the Aegean, boys lived in barracks under sparse conditions, undergoing constant physical training, drills, and tests of endurance. They learned to read and sing. Spartans loved choral poetry and music, but most of all to obey and to endure pain and hardship. One famous anecdote tells of a Spartan boy who hid a stolen fox under his tunic. The fox was gnawing at his belly, but he stayed silent and died rather than admit to the theft. A grim illustration of Spartan steely self-control. At 20, a Spartan man officially became a soldier and joined a Sicilian mess hall group, where he would dine with comrades every day on simple fare. The notorious black broth was a staple. A blood soup the Spartans considered a delicacy. The result of this system was a citizenry hardened for war and absolutely loyal to Sparta. Spartan hoplites, armored infantrymen, were considered the best in Greece. Trained to fight in the phalanx formation from youth, they moved and fought as a single impenetrable unit. Never retreat, never surrender, was essentially their creed. The highest honor was to die in battle for Sparta. When Spartan mothers gave their sons a shield before battle, the saying goes, they exhorted, "Come back with your shield or on it." In short, Spartans prized courage, discipline, and obedience above all. What of the rest of society? The Helots, as mentioned, did the manual labor, farming especially, to free the Spartan men for war. The Helots were treated harshly. The Spartans would even ritually declare war on Helots annually so that killing them was legally permissible, and young Spartans were encouraged to terrorize them to prevent rebellion. It was a grim aspect of Spartan life, essentially a form of apartheid and constant oppression. There was also a class called the perioikoi, free non-citizen inhabitants of Laconia who handled trade and crafts since full Spartans scorned such work. The perioikoi were under Spartan control, but not enslaved. They could be called up for military service, but had no say in Spartan policy. Interestingly, Spartan women had a very different experience from other Greek women. Since the men were often away in training or war, Spartan women managed many of the city's day-to-day affairs and estates. They were encouraged to be physically fit. They engaged in their own sports, received some education, and were notably outspoken by Greek standards. Aristotle, who was not a fan of Sparta, remarked that Spartan women enjoyed too much freedom. A famous anecdote has an Athenian telling a Spartan woman, "You women of Sparta are the only ones who rule men," to which she replied, "Yes, we are the only ones who give birth to men." This captures the Spartan women's pride. Their main role was to bear strong sons for the state, but in the meantime, they exercised a level of autonomy uncommon in the ancient world. The Spartan dedication to tradition made them somewhat conservative culturally. They produced no great sculptors or philosophers. Spartans famously had little use for long speeches or elaborate art. The word laconic, meaning brief and pithy, comes from Laconia, their region. However, they did produce renowned poets like Alcman, who composed beautiful choral hymns for Spartan maidens. And Sparta's reverence for law and order was in itself a kind of ideal that other Greeks respected. Many Greek thinkers, while uneasy about Sparta's harshness, admired the eunomia, good order, and stability of its society. For about 300 years, from 600 to 300 BC, Sparta had no significant civil strife, a claim no other Greek city could make. Its citizens were famously loyal and cohesive. Sparta played a key role in Greek history as the counterbalance to Athens. The two cities could not have been more different in ethos. One valued freedom and innovation, the other order and tradition. One had walls and a navy, the other relied on its army and famously had no walls. Sparta used to boast its walls were its soldiers. Yet when Greece was imperiled by the Persian invasion, Athens and Sparta worked together to save the homeland. That alliance, however, was temporary. Their rivalry eventually plunged Greece into the Peloponnesian War. We will explore those events later. For now, understand Sparta as a society single-mindedly geared to producing elite warriors. It opted for equality among the Spartan citizens at the cost of suppressing an entire enslaved population beneath them. In summary, Sparta was a paradox, a Greek city that resisted the trends of the Greek world. While others built grand temples, Spartans left theirs rough. While others debated in the assembly, Spartans voted by acclamation without discussion. While others built fleets of trading ships, Spartans stuck to the soil and spear. And yet, Sparta was crucial in the Greek story, a formidable power that could not be ignored. Its very otherness spurred the Athenians and others to define their own values in contrast. Together, Athens and Sparta exemplify the range of what the Polis could be. Having looked at two iconic city-states, let's step back from politics and war for a moment and examine the texture of daily life in ancient Greece. How did ordinary Greeks live, work, and worship? What was it like to be a farmer, a woman, a slave, or a child in those times? Understanding daily life will give us a richer picture of ancient Greek civilization beyond its famous battles and marble buildings. Although much of history remembers kings, battles, and great thinkers, most ancient Greeks were ordinary people. They spent their days farming, raising children, honoring local rituals, and enjoying simple comforts. Daily life in ancient Greece could vary from one city-state to another. Athens was not Sparta, for instance. Still, across the Greek world, there were common threads in food, home life, work, and social structure. Here we'll sketch those patterns for the classical era, roughly 5th to 4th century BC, with a few notes from earlier times as well. Most Greek citizens were farmers by necessity. In a world without supermarkets, each household tried to be as self-sufficient as possible. A typical farm grew grain, barley or wheat for bread, along with olives for oil and grapes for wine. Olive oil mattered enormously. It was used for cooking, for lamp fuel, for washing, and even for skin care. In some places, uprooting an olive tree was treated as a crime. That alone shows how valuable the olive was. The climate could make grain farming difficult because rain was unreliable. So many families also kept goats or sheep. They grew vegetables, figs, and lentils to round out their diet. The farming year had its own steady rhythm. September brought the grape harvest. People often treaded grapes by foot, pressing them into juice that would ferment into wine. Autumn brought the olive harvest and the pressing of oil. Spring was the season for harvesting grain with sickles. These cycles shaped daily life. Everyone helped: men, women, children, and often slaves as well. Food in Greece was healthy, but by modern standards it was simple. Bread or porridge made from barley or wheat was the staple. Alongside it came cheese from goats or sheep, vegetables such as onions, garlic, and cabbage, and plenty of olive oil. Meat was a luxury for many. People often ate it at festivals or after sacrifices, when a community might share the roasted meat. Fish and seafood were more available, especially near the coast. Markets sold fish, octopus, and shellfish, and fishermen caught what they could. Fruit was eaten in season. Honey was the main sweetener, since there was no sugar. Greeks loved honey, using it in cakes and to sweeten wine. Wine itself was a daily drink for adults, but it was usually diluted with water. Many Greeks considered it barbaric to drink wine undiluted. Greek houses were modest by today's standards. Many were built of sun-dried clay bricks set on a stone foundation. A common design placed rooms around a small courtyard. The courtyard brought light and air, and it also served as a workspace for daily tasks. Rooms were basic, spaces for storage, cooking, and sleeping. Wealthier homes might have an upper floor. In cities like Athens, houses stood close together on narrow streets. By most accounts, these streets could be noisy and dirty, vendors calling out, animals bleating, carts rattling by. Family life was centered in the home. Men often spent much of the day outside, working fields, visiting the agora, or attending public life. Citizen-class women, especially in places like Athens, usually stayed closer to home or the immediate neighborhood. Greek society was patriarchal. The Kyrios, the male head of household, had legal authority over the family. Marriages were commonly arranged. Girls often married young, in their mid-teens. Men were often older, sometimes in their late 20s or beyond. In Athens, respectable women tended to live in relative seclusion. Many homes even had separate women's quarters, sometimes called the gynoeceum. Women might go out to fetch water, attend certain religious festivals, or visit female neighbors, but their public presence was limited. Sparta was different. Spartan women had more freedom and physical training, but that was the exception. Daily life also meant constant domestic work. Many necessities had to be made at home. Textile production, for example, never truly stopped. Women spun wool or flax into yarn, then wove cloth on looms for clothing and bedding. Bread was baked regularly, and dough was kneaded at home. Cooking happened over a hearth. Meals were usually simple: porridge, bread, stews, vegetables, cheese, and oil. Homes did not have modern bathrooms. People washed with basins, and public baths existed in some cities, especially for men. At night, light came from oil lamps filled with olive oil. Children grew up differently, depending on gender and status. Young boys in many cities stayed at home until around 7. If the family could afford it, boys then went to school. They learned reading, writing, arithmetic, and memorized poetry. Homer, above all, was the core text. Boys also trained physically in the gymnasium. Girls were usually educated at home. They learned skills like weaving, cooking, and household management. They learned songs and myths. Some girls may have learned to read and write, but formal schooling for girls was rare. Again, Sparta being a partial exception. Greek children did have toys and games. Archaeologists have found terracotta dolls, rattles, yo-yos, and miniature chariots. Children played many simple games, including one called ephedrismos, a piggyback game, and they often played outdoors with hoops or knucklebones, an early form of jacks. In every Greek city, society was stratified. At the top were citizens, adult free men with political rights. In democracies like Athens, tens of thousands were citizens. In oligarchies, the citizen group could be much smaller. Citizens could own land, serve in the military, and take part in government. Below citizens were medics in places like Athens. Medics were resident foreigners. Many were craftsmen, traders, or bankers. They contributed to the economy, but they had no political rights and paid special taxes. Some lived nearly as well as citizens, but legally they remained outsiders. Then there were slaves, who formed a significant part of the labor force. Slavery in Greece was not based on race. Slaves were usually war captives, purchased foreigners, or in earlier times, people trapped by debt. Athens abolished debt bondage under Solon. A wealthy household might have many slaves, one to fetch water, one to accompany the master, another to help with children, and others for cooking, cleaning, or skilled work. Even modest farmers might have 1 or 2 slaves to help in the fields or in the home. Life for slaves varied widely. Some worked as skilled artisans or clerks. Some served as tutors, educating the master's children. Others labored in the silver mines of Laurion, which could be brutal. Slaves were legally property, yet they were woven into daily life. In some households, they might feel like a familiar presence, though they had no legal family rights of their own. Daily life was not only work. The Greeks valued leisure, and much of it had cultural meaning. For men, a visit to the agora in the morning was common. People went to buy and sell goods, but also to meet friends, exchange news, and discuss politics. The agora was the heartbeat of public life. Stalls sold fruit, fish, and pottery, and there, too, philosophers might speak with students, while sophists offered demonstrations. In the afternoon, many men visited the gymnasium or palaestra to exercise. Physical fitness was admired. People trained by wrestling, running, and throwing the javelin or discus. This was exercise, social life, and education all at once. In the evening, the main meal, the deipnon, was eaten. Sometimes men attended a symposium, a drinking party held in a private home. Guests reclined on couches, sipped diluted wine, and talked. They played games, listened to music, or enjoyed poetry. Respectable women did not usually attend symposia. The women present were often entertainers, such as flute girls and dancers, or courtesans known as hetairai, who could be educated companions. Symposia could be intellectual, but they could also turn rowdy, depending on the crowd and the wine. For broader entertainment, religious festivals punctuated the year. Festivals mixed sacred observance with communal joy. In Athens, the Panathenaea each summer honored Athena with processions, sacrifices, and athletic and musical contests. The Dionysia featured processions and drama competitions, and it gave rise to tragedies and comedies that are still read today. On festival days, normal work paused. Even slaves might get some rest. People watched plays, cheered at contests, and felt the city gather around shared rituals. Winners gained honor and sometimes prizes, like amphorae of olive oil for Panathenaic victors. Religion permeated daily life deeply. Many people began the day with a prayer or a small offering. A family might keep a small altar in the courtyard, making libations to Hestia, goddess of the hearth, or to Zeus Ktesios, protector of the storeroom. Stepping out the door, someone might whisper a brief prayer to Zeus Herkaios, guardian of the household boundary. City life was full of shrines and sacred spaces. A traveler passing a roadside shrine to Hermes might pause to leave a pebble or a flower. In moments of worry or decision, ordinary people sought guidance from an oracle or a seer. They also interpreted signs in daily life, strange birds, sudden storms, unusual dreams, as hints from the gods. In many ways, the daily rhythms of Greek life still feel recognizable. Work began at sunrise. Markets bustled by day. Families gathered at dusk. Life was demanding, yet people found time for civic engagement and communal celebration. The simplicity of a Greek home and diet was balanced by the richness of social and cultural life. A farmer might toil in the fields, then later sit in a theater watching a play by Sophocles, hearing stories of fate and choice. A potter might spend hours at the wheel, yet hum Homeric verses while he worked. In their everyday lives, the Greeks interlaced the mundane with the aspirational, bios, life, with paideia, culture, and education. Now that we've sketched daily existence, we can move into the spiritual world that surrounded it. The gods were everywhere in a Greek's daily life. Next, we'll explore their beliefs, rituals, and the rich tapestry of myth that still captivates our imaginations. The ancient Greeks lived in a world they believed was alive with gods. Religion was not a separate part of life. It was woven into daily routines, family customs, and the public life of the city. To be Greek was to share in a set of rituals and stories. People honored the Olympian gods, revered local deities and heroes, and took part in festivals that bound the community together. Greek religion did not have one holy book. It did not have a single church hierarchy either. Instead, it was a tradition, customs, prayers, and ceremonies passed down across generations. Mythology, the stories of gods and heroes, served as a kind of sacred memory. These tales explained the world in poetic terms. Greeks did not always take every story literally, but they treated the myths with deep cultural reverence. At the heart of Greek religion stood the great Olympian gods. People often speak of 12, though lists can vary depending on the source. Zeus was the leader, king of the gods. He ruled the sky and storms, and his symbol was the thunderbolt. Hera stood beside him as queen. She protected marriage, and in myth, she was famously jealous of Zeus's many affairs. Poseidon, Zeus's brother, ruled the sea. Sailors prayed to him for safe voyages, and they offered sacrifices to calm his temper. Hades, the other brother, ruled the underworld. He was one of the major gods, though he was not usually counted among the Olympians because his realm lay below the earth. Each god had distinct domains and symbols. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy in war, was the patron of Athens. She was often shown with helmet and spear. The owl and the olive tree were sacred to her. Apollo was god of music, prophecy, and healing. He carried a lyre, and his oracle at Delphi was famous across Greece. Artemis, his twin, was goddess of the hunt and the wild. She was often pictured with bow and arrows. Ares represented the brutal side of war. Aphrodite, born from sea foam in myth, ruled love and beauty. Hermes was the swift messenger of the gods. He was also patron of merchants, thieves, and crossroads. Demeter guarded agriculture and the fertility of the earth. Her grief for Persephone, her daughter, helped the Greeks explain the coming of winter. Hephaestus was the divine craftsman, the smith of Olympus. In myth, he forged weapons and armor for gods and heroes. Dionysus, god of wine and theater, represented ecstasy and transformation. His worship could be intense and emotional, spilling into song and wild dances. These gods were imagined in human form. They were immortal and powerful, yet their personalities were strikingly human. They could be loving or jealous, generous or cruel, calm one moment and unpredictable the next. Greek myths are full of these divine dramas. Zeus pursues lovers. Hera takes vengeance. Athena helps heroes with clever guidance. Poseidon punishes with storms and sea wrath. The stories could entertain, but they also carried meaning. Myths helped explain natural patterns. Persephone's descent and return, for example, was linked to the seasons. Myths also gave divine examples for cultural customs, and they offered moral lessons through narrative. The story of Prometheus, the titan who stole fire for humanity, explored the cost of knowledge and the tension between power and progress. The labors of Heracles showed endurance and redemption through struggle. Other myths traced the origins of the world and the gods, as in Hesiod's Theogony, which begins in chaos and unfolds into a divine family tree. Greek religion was not only myth, it was also ritual, things people did again and again as part of public and private life. The central act of worship was sacrifice, often the sacrifice of an animal. On a festival day, citizens might gather at a temple. A procession could lead a bull or a goat to an altar, adorned with wreaths. Prayers were spoken. Barley grains might be scattered. Then, in a swift moment, the animal was killed. As blood touched the altar, women raised a ritual cry, an ololij. The animal was then butchered. The gods were believed to receive the smoke of burning fat and bones, while the meat was roasted and shared among the people. Sacrifice was both devotion and communal meal. It reinforced social bonds. It also expressed a simple logic. We give to the gods, and we hope the gods will give to us in return. Beyond sacrifice, people left offerings. These could be small or grand. A person might dedicate pottery, figurines, weapons, or engraved inscriptions. Sanctuaries became layered with these gifts over time, silent evidence of countless prayers. A poor person might leave a small clay model of a body part at a healing shrine, asking for relief. A victorious athlete might dedicate a javelin. A sailor, grateful after surviving a storm, might hang a wreath in Poseidon's temple. These offerings made devotion visible. They were gratitude made tangible. Greek religion was also civic. Every city had patron gods and local heroes. Athens honored Athena above all. Her sacred statue stood in the Erechtheion, and the great Panathenaic procession presented her with a newly woven peplos, a ceremonial robe. Other cities had different divine centers. In Argos, Hera was especially revered. In Ephesus, Artemis. In Corinth, Poseidon and Aphrodite held pride of place. Temples were not only sacred spaces, they were part of a city's identity. Cities funded sacrifices. They built and maintained sanctuaries. Priests and priestesses were usually citizens, often serving for a set term. There was no separate priestly caste. Being a priest could resemble holding public office. Festivals filled the calendar. They were feast days, moments when the normal work of life paused and the city gathered together. The Olympic Games were one of the great Pan-Hellenic festivals that united Greeks from many regions. But each polis also had its own long cycle of local festivals. These days included processions, contests, music, drama, and shared meals. In Athens, the Dionysia included drama competitions, processions, hymns, and plenty of wine in honor of Dionysus. The Thesmophoria, a women-only festival for Demeter, focused on fertility and the well-being of the land and family. Some rituals were gentle and some were harsh. In Sparta, boys were tested in rites linked to Artemis Orthia. Other festivals included torch races, war dances, and competitions of every kind. Religion marked the stages of life, too. Births, coming-of-age ceremonies, marriages, and funerals all had ritual forms. Even death was surrounded by careful practices, meant to guide the spirit safely to the underworld and protect the living from unrest. Myth also lived beyond temples. It shaped culture. It was sung, recited, and performed. Epic poems like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and works by Hesiod, gave the Greeks a shared imaginative world. Later, tragedies performed in theaters reworked these myths to explore deep human questions. They returned again and again to certain themes. One was hubris, excessive pride, and the idea that it invites nemesis, divine retribution. This appeared in stories like Arachne, who challenged Athena, and Icarus, who flew too high. Another theme was the uncertainty of divine favor. Even heroes suffered. Heracles endured his labors. Achilles, the greatest warrior, still carried a fatal weakness. Alongside public religion, there were also mystery cults. These involved private initiation and promised spiritual insight, sometimes even a happier fate after death. The Eleusinian mysteries, honoring Demeter and Persephone, were the most famous. Initiates swore oaths of secrecy, so we still do not know the details. But participants often described the experience as hopeful. It offered comfort in a culture that frequently imagined the afterlife as a dim, shadowy place. Other mystery traditions grew later as well, including forms of Dionysian worship and Orphic teachings that focused on the soul and its destiny. Religion and myth were the soul of Greek life. Identity was tied to honoring the gods, pleasing them, and keeping tradition alive. Temples were not only masterpieces of art, they were active houses of worship. The Parthenon, for example, was both a symbol of civic pride and a sacred home for Athena. Greek religious imagery still echoes in our world. Zeus with the thunderbolt, Athena with the owl, Hermes as the messenger. And Greek myths are still retold because they speak to something enduring: love and loss, pride and punishment, fate and choice. With this spiritual world in mind, we can better understand what came next. Out of a culture suffused with myth arose people who began asking different kinds of questions. They sought natural explanations. They explored ethics. They argued about knowledge and virtue. Now it is time to turn to the Greek philosophers and to the beginnings of Western thought. In a culture steeped in myth and tradition, the ancient Greeks did something revolutionary. They invented philosophy, literally, the love of wisdom. Instead of relying only on myth or divine revelation, some Greeks began to use observation, logic, and debate. They asked basic questions about nature, existence, and how a person should live. This shift did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually from the 6th century BC onward. But by the classical period, Greece was home to thinkers whose names still echo today: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and many others. The first Greek philosophers are often called the pre-Socratics because they came before Socrates. In the 6th century BC, in the Greek cities of Ionia on the coast of modern Turkey, thinkers began searching for the underlying order of nature. They wanted a natural explanation for the world, something deeper than legend. Thales of Miletus is one of the earliest names we know. He supposedly argued that water is the origin of all things. In other words, beneath the variety of the world, there is one underlying principle. Anaximander proposed something more abstract: the apeiron, the boundless, as the source of all things. Heraclitus looked at the world and saw constant change. He is remembered for the idea that you cannot step in the same river twice. For him, fire symbolized a universe always in motion. These early philosophers were, in a sense, the first scientists. They searched for causes in nature itself. Tradition even credits Thales with predicting a solar eclipse. Another major figure was Pythagoras of Samos. He moved to southern Italy and founded a community with philosophical and religious features. Pythagoras believed that number and mathematical relationships underlie reality. This tradition gave us the famous Pythagorean theorem, but it also gave a larger worldview. All is number. The Pythagoreans found harmony in music, and they imagined harmony in the cosmos as well. At this stage, Greeks did not separate science from philosophy. A single thinker might study astronomy, geometry, and metaphysics together. Not every theory was correct, of course. Empedocles' idea of 4 elements, earth, water, air, fire, had a long legacy. Democritus's theory of atoms was remarkably forward-looking, even if it lacked experimental proof. What mattered most was the method. They were building a habit of rational inquiry, and that habit set the stage for the great trio to come. Socrates, 469 to 399 BC, is one of the most famous figures in Western philosophy. Yet he left behind no writings of his own that survive. We know him mainly through his student Plato and through a few other sources. Socrates spent his days in Athens talking with people. He asked questions about virtue, justice, courage, and piety. In short, he asked how one ought to live. His approach became known as the Socratic method. He would pretend not to know, then ask simple, pointed questions. Step by step, he exposed contradictions in what others claimed to believe. In Plato's dialogues, we see him asking questions like, "What is justice?" or "What is courage?" Politicians, poets, and generals would answer confidently at first. Then, under gentle pressure, their definitions would fall apart. Socrates believed that honest questioning could bring a person closer to truth. He also believed it could cultivate the soul. He is famously associated with the idea that the unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates differed from the sophists of his day. Sophists taught rhetoric for a fee, often training people to win arguments. Socrates claimed he was not a teacher at all, only a questioner. But his questioning made powerful people uncomfortable. In 399 BC, after Athens had endured turmoil and defeat in the Peloponnesian War, Socrates was put on trial. He was accused of impiety and of corrupting the youth. He defended himself, but he was condemned to death. He accepted the sentence calmly, and he drank hemlock as required. His death turned him into a symbol. To many later thinkers, he became a martyr for integrity and truth-seeking. Plato, 427 to 347 BC, was Socrates' pupil. He went on to found the Academy in Athens, often considered the first organized institution of higher learning in the Western world. Plato was deeply affected by Socrates' execution. He also grew disillusioned with Athenian politics. Out of that experience, he built a philosophy both ambitious and complex. One of his central ideas is the theory of forms. Plato argued that beyond the material world we see with our senses, there exists a higher realm of perfect, unchanging forms. These forms are ideals, like justice, beauty, or the perfect circle. The things we see around us are imperfect copies or reflections of these ideals. For Plato, the world of appearances is always in flux, and it can deceive. The world of forms is stable, it is eternal, and it can be grasped by the mind. Plato illustrated this with his famous metaphor of the cave in the Republic. He imagines people chained in a cave, watching shadows on a wall. They mistake those shadows for reality. The philosopher is like someone who breaks free, walks out into the sunlight, and finally sees what is real. It is painful at first, but it is also transformative. Plato applied philosophy to ethics and politics. In the Republic, he describes an ideal state ruled by philosopher kings, leaders trained to understand the highest truths, especially the form of the good. He also described the human soul as having three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. A just person, he said, is one whose inner life is balanced, with reason guiding the whole. Plato wrote in dialogues, often using Socrates as a central character. His works are not only philosophical texts, they are literary creations as well. Through Plato, Socratic questioning was preserved and shaped into a lasting tradition. Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, Plato's most famous student, took a different path. Plato tended to reach upward toward the abstract. Aristotle looked closely at the world in front of him. He believed knowledge begins with observation, and he wanted to understand causes, patterns, and purposes. Aristotle wrote about nearly everything: logic, metaphysics, ethics, politics, biology, psychology, rhetoric, and more. He disagreed with Plato's theory of forms. Aristotle thought form and matter belong together. The form of a thing, its essence, is not in a separate realm. It exists in the thing itself. An acorn, for instance, carries within it the potential form of an oak. Aristotle also loved classification. In biology, he dissected animals and grouped them by shared features. In logic, he developed a formal system of syllogisms, rules of deductive reasoning that shaped thought for centuries. In ethics, especially in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle described virtue as a mean between extremes. Courage, for example, lies between rashness and cowardice. Virtue is not simply an idea. It is a habit formed through practice. The goal of life, Aristotle said, is eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or happiness. It is the fullest good life a human being can live. In politics, Aristotle studied many constitutions and argued that a balanced, mixed form of government might be best. He favored polity, a kind of mixed constitution, over pure democracy or pure oligarchy. Aristotle also tutored a young prince who became Alexander the Great. Aristotle's influence, though, reached far beyond any one student. His works shaped the Lyceum, the school he founded, and later became foundational texts in both the Islamic world and medieval Europe. Together, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are often seen as the great trio of Greek philosophy, but they were not the end of the story. After Aristotle, in the Hellenistic period, new schools emerged. They focused on a practical question: how should a person live in a changing world? Four major traditions are often highlighted: Stoicism, Epicureanism, Skepticism, and Cynicism. Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium around 300 BC, taught that the good life comes from living according to nature and reason. The Stoics emphasized virtue as the only true good. They urged emotional resilience, meeting misfortune with steady calm. They used a word for that inner steadiness: ataraxia, meaning unperturbedness. Stoics trained themselves to remember that external things, wealth, reputation, even health, are not fully under our control, so we should not be ruled by fear or desire. Epicureanism, associated with Epicurus, 341 to 270 BC, offered a different path. Epicurus also aimed at happiness, but he defined pleasure carefully. For him, the best pleasure was the absence of pain and anxiety. Epicurus did not advocate wild indulgence. He praised simple pleasures, close friendships, and quiet reflection. He also taught people to let go of irrational fears, including fear of the gods and fear of death. Epicureans believed the gods exist, but do not meddle in human affairs. Skepticism, especially the Pyrrhonian skeptics after Pyrrho of Elis, argued that certain knowledge is impossible to secure. Their response was to suspend judgment, a practice called epoche. They believed that letting go of certainty could bring peace of mind. Cynicism, linked to Antisthenes and famously lived by Diogenes of Sinope, pushed simplicity to an extreme. Cynics rejected social conventions, wealth, and luxury. They aimed to live in accordance with nature, freely and honestly. Diogenes became legendary for owning almost nothing and openly mocking people's pretensions. The word cynic comes from the Greek for dog-like, because these philosophers were seen as shameless in their disdain for polite society. Despite their differences, these schools shared a core concern. They wanted to answer the same question: how should a person live to achieve the good life? Greek philosophy's influence only grew over time. Romans absorbed and adapted these ideas. Early Christian thinkers engaged with Platonic and Aristotelian concepts. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars such as Avicenna and Averroes studied and preserved Aristotle, later helping reintroduce his work to Europe. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Greek philosophy is its method. It taught people to reason, to argue carefully, and to seek explanations beyond tradition or authority. When you read a Socratic dialogue, follow a geometrical proof, or consider Aristotle's analysis of governments, you are touching a mode of thought first systematically pursued in ancient Greece. With these philosophers, we see the intellectual flowering of Greece. Yet even as these great minds were at work, Greece faced rising external threats. The next part of the story turns to the Greco-Persian Wars, when Greeks, both thoughtful Athenians and austere Spartans, united to defend their freedom against the vast Persian Empire. In the early 5th century BC, the Greek city-states faced a threat unlike any they had seen before. It was the colossal Persian Empire, stretching from Asia Minor and Egypt to Babylon and far beyond. The clash between Greeks and Persians was more than a series of battles. It became a defining moment in Greek history. For a time, it drew rival city-states into uneasy unity. It also sharpened a sense of Greek identity, set against the barbarian, meaning the non-Greek outsider. The Persian Wars included two major invasions of Greece. The first came in 490 BC. The second, far larger, began in 480 BC and lasted into 479 BC. Against enormous odds, the Greeks won victories that later generations would celebrate in drama, art, and history. Free cities, it seemed, had defied imperial power. The trouble began in Ionia, the Greek cities on the coast of Anatolia in modern Turkey. These cities fell under Persian rule in the mid-6th century BC, when Cyrus the Great conquered Lydia. Discontent grew under Persian-backed tyrants. In 499 BC, the Ionian Greeks revolted in what we call the Ionian Revolt. They received limited help from Athens and from a small city, Eretria. Athenian ships crossed the Aegean and helped burn Sardis, a Persian regional capital. The revolt was eventually crushed by 494 BC. But the Persian king Darius I was furious with Athens for interfering. Tradition says he ordered a servant to remind him each day, "Master, remember the Athenians." In 490 BC, Darius launched the first invasion of mainland Greece. His forces crossed the Aegean, moving from island to island, and landed on the plains of Marathon, northeast of Athens. The Athenians marched out to meet them. They were aided only by a small force from Plataea. Sparta was delayed and missed the battle. At Marathon, the Athenians fought under the command of Miltiades. Though outnumbered, they attacked boldly. They even ran toward the Persians, closing the distance quickly. In a decisive tactical move, they strengthened their flanks. Those flanks then wrapped around the Persian center. It was a stunning victory. The Persians were routed and fled back to their ships. Legend adds a dramatic detail. A messenger named Phidippides is said to have run the 26 miles back to Athens. He announced victory. "Rejoice, we conquer," and then collapsed. Whatever the truth of the legend, Marathon was more than a battlefield success. It was a psychological triumph. It proved that the Persians could be beaten. Herodotus gives famous numbers: 192 Athenian dead and 6,400 Persians. Those figures may be exaggerated, but the outcome was real. Darius's invasion had been stopped. Yet the Persian threat did not end. Darius's son, Xerxes I, prepared a far greater invasion. He aimed to subdue Greece once and for all. In 480 BC, Xerxes launched the second invasion. Greek sources claimed the Persian army numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Later writers spoke of 5 million. That is almost certainly an exaggeration. Modern estimates suggest perhaps 100,000 to 150,000. Xerxes also made a show of power and engineering. He bridged the Hellespont by building a pontoon bridge of boats across the strait. Then he marched through Thrace and Macedon into Greece, while his navy sailed along the coast. To face this, a coalition formed, about 31 Greek city-states. Sparta led on land, Athens led at sea. Many Greek states submitted to Xerxes or stayed neutral. The odds looked hopeless, yet Athens and Sparta, often rivals, united for survival. The first major land encounter came at Thermopylae in 480 BC. Thermopylae was a narrow mountain pass. There, numbers mattered less. King Leonidas of Sparta led a small force, around 7,000 Greeks, including his famous 300 Spartans. For 2 days they held the pass, beating back wave after wave of Persians. They even resisted Xerxes' elite troops, the Immortals. The defense ended only when the Persians found a hidden path. It was revealed, according to Greek accounts, by a traitor named Ephialtes. The Persians outflanked the Greeks. Leonidas dismissed most of the allied troops. He remained with a rearguard of Spartans and Thespians who fought to the death. Thermopylae was a defeat, but it bought time, and it became a story of sacrifice that inspired the rest of Greece. Around the same time, the Persian navy was checked by the Greeks at Artemisium. The fighting there was intense, but indecisive. After learning of Thermopylae's fall, the Greeks withdrew. With the pass open, Xerxes marched into central Greece. The Athenians evacuated their city. An oracle had spoken of wooden walls. Many Athenians took this to mean the fleet. Athens put its faith in triremes, fast warships powered by rows of oars. Those ships existed in large numbers, thanks to a rich silver strike a few years earlier. Themistocles had persuaded the Athenians to use that wealth for shipbuilding. Athens was occupied and burned by the Persians. It was a heavy blow, but the decisive turn of the war came at sea. At the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, Themistocles lured the Persian fleet into narrow waters. In the tight straits of Salamis, the Persians could not use their larger numbers effectively. Their ships struggled to maneuver. Greek triremes struck hard. They rammed and shattered Persian vessels. Many Persian ships were sunk or captured. The victory threatened Persian supply lines. It also threatened Xerxes' personal safety. Greek accounts say Xerxes watched the battle from a hillside. After the defeat, he feared being trapped in Europe. He withdrew with much of his army back to Asia. He left his general Mardonius behind with an occupation force, intending to continue the campaign the next year. In 479 BC, the Greeks regrouped. They confronted the remaining Persian army at Plataea in Boeotia. The battle was fierce and chaotic. Greek hoplites fought in heavy armor. Spartans and Tegeans held the right wing. Athenians fought on the left. In the end, the Greeks overwhelmed the Persians. Mardonius was killed. The Persian camp was captured. The invasion was effectively ended. According to legend, that same day the Greeks also won at Mycale, on the coast of Ionia. There they destroyed much of the Persian fleet and sparked a final uprising among the Ionian Greeks. However exactly events unfolded, the meaning was clear. Greece was free. The Persian Wars had enormous consequences. Athens emerged with great prestige because its fleet had been vital. Soon after, Athens formed the Delian League, presented as an alliance to continue the struggle against Persia and protect Greek cities. Over time, Athens exerted more and more control. the League gradually became an Athenian empire. That growth would later provoke conflict with Sparta and others. In the immediate aftermath, there was a surge of pride and rebuilding. Monuments were raised. One of the most famous inscriptions honored the dead at Thermopylae. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." Athens also began reconstructing on a grander scale. A few decades later, in the mid-5th century, this would culminate in the Parthenon. The wars also gained an ideological meaning. Greeks often framed the conflict as freedom versus despotism. They imagined citizen soldiers triumphing over subjects ruled by a great king. Herodotus sometimes praises Persians, and he does not paint them as simple villains, but he clearly admires the Greek determination to remain autonomous. The wars also highlighted the power of navies. Athens' fleet was manned largely by lower-class citizens who rode the triremes. Their importance in victory strengthened their demand for political influence at home. In this way, sea power helped push Athens toward deeper democratic developments. From the Persian perspective, the wars were a minor frontier conflict. The empire remained vast and strong, and it would continue for another 150 years until Alexander. But for the Greeks, repelling Persia was a civilizational victory. It allowed Greek culture to flourish on its own terms. In our story, the Persian Wars open the gate to the classical period, the golden age of Greece. After Salamis and Plataea, especially for Athens, a remarkable era began. Tragedy and comedy flourished. History writing took shape. Sculpture and architecture reached new heights. Yet success also bred rivalry, and that rivalry would lead to the bitter Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. Before we reach that conflict, let's pause for a moment in the classical sunlight. Freed from foreign threat, for now, the Greek city-states, led by Athens, produced an outpouring of creativity and power that has rarely been matched. It is to that classical period, its triumphs and its trials, that we now turn. The classical period of ancient Greece, roughly the 5th and 4th centuries BC, is often seen as the high point of Greek civilization. It was an age of extraordinary achievement in art, drama, philosophy, and public life. It was also an age of intense political drama. Athens rose to dominance. Sparta resisted. Rivalries hardened into war. And over time, the independence of the city-states faded, ending in conquest by Macedon under Philip II and Alexander the Great. It was, in other words, an era of brilliant splendor and profound tragedy. After the Persian Wars, Athens soared to unprecedented influence. Much of this rise is associated with Pericles, a dominant statesman from about 460 BC until his death in 429 BC. Under Pericles, Athens strengthened its democracy. One reform was especially important. Ordinary citizens were paid for jury service, which allowed even poorer Athenians to take part in the courts and council. Athens also launched a grand building program. The Acropolis was crowned with the Parthenon, completed in the mid-5th century BC, along with other magnificent structures. These projects honored the gods, especially Athena. They also displayed Athens' wealth and leadership. Master sculptors such as Phidias oversaw this work. Greek sculpture reached a balance and realism that would set a standard for ages. Think of the Discobolus in its calm poise, or the Zeus or Poseidon of Artemision, capturing motion in bronze. Athenian drama reached its zenith in this period. In the theater of Dionysus, playwrights such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides staged tragedies that explored moral dilemmas and divine justice. Their stories were often set in mythic worlds, yet they spoke to contemporary concerns. Aeschylus's Oresteia trilogy, for example, examines justice and the shift from personal vengeance to legal judgment. It can be read as reflecting Athens' pride in its courts. Comedy flourished as well. Aristophanes wrote plays that mocked politicians and social fashions. In Lysistrata, women withhold sex to pressure men to end war. In The Clouds, Aristophanes pokes fun at Socrates and at intellectual trends. This era also saw the rise of history writing as a critical discipline. Herodotus wrote his histories about the Persian Wars, blending investigation with travel tales and storytelling. Thucydides, writing later, took a more rigorous approach to the Peloponnesian War. He searched for factual accuracy and rational explanations, and he tried to avoid divine causes in his analysis. Thucydides remains one of the most powerful writers on war, power, and human nature under strain. Politically, the 5th century BC was defined by the Peloponnesian War from 431 to 404 BC. The roots of the conflict lay in resentment toward Athenian imperialism. The Delian League, which Athens led, gradually shifted from alliance to empire. Athens moved the League treasury from Delos to Athens. It demanded tribute. It forced members to remain in the League, and it often intervened in their governments. Sparta and its allies, the Peloponnesian League, grew wary of Athenian power. Tensions rose through a series of disputes. Athens issued the Megarian Decree, an economic sanction against an ally of Sparta. Other conflicts followed. War broke out in 431 BC. The Peloponnesian War was long and ruinous. It lasted 27 years, with a temporary truce in the middle. In broad terms, Athens had the stronger navy and greater wealth. Sparta had the superior land army, especially its hoplite infantry. Pericles' strategy was to avoid major land battles with the Spartan phalanx. Athens would rely on its fleet to bring supplies to the city and to raid the Spartan coast. In the early years, Pericles brought rural people inside Athens' long walls, while Sparta ravaged the countryside. This created severe overcrowding. The next year, a plague struck Athens. It killed perhaps a third of the population, and it also took Pericles himself. After his death, Athenian leadership became more erratic. The war saw dramatic episodes. At Sphacteria, an Athenian force captured Spartan soldiers, shocking to many Greeks because Spartans were expected to die rather than surrender. In the war's middle years, a truce known as the Peace of Nicias temporarily halted the fighting, but it did not hold. A major turning point came when Athens launched a vast expedition against Syracuse in Sicily. The campaign ended in disaster. The Athenian fleet and army were destroyed. Thousands of Athenians were killed or enslaved. The defeat shifted momentum toward Sparta. Around this time, Persia entered the conflict as well. Persian funds helped Sparta build a navy in exchange for Spartan acknowledgement of Persian control over Ionia. With this support, Sparta could fight Athens at sea. The war resumed with Sparta now able to field fleets. After nearly 3 decades of attrition, Athens was blockaded and starved. It surrendered. Athens' empire collapsed. Sparta forced Athens to tear down its long walls and to surrender all but a dozen ships. Sparta had won. Yet the victory did not bring peace to Greece. The war left the Greek world exhausted. Sparta attempted to impose oligarchic governments, including the notorious 30 tyrants in Athens. But these regimes were short-lived. Athens soon restored its democracy. Meanwhile, New conflicts emerged. Persia continued to meddle. Thebes challenged Spartan dominance. Sparta's harsh rule alienated many former allies. Thebes rose under leaders such as Epaminondas. At Leuctra in 371 BC, Theban forces defeated the Spartans and shattered their military reputation. Thebes even liberated Messenia, ending centuries of Helot servitude for the Messenians. For a brief time, Thebes was ascendant. Theban armies invaded the Peloponnese and threatened Sparta itself. But constant war kept Greece divided and drained. During the 4th century, Greek philosophy and culture still thrived. Plato was active during and after the Peloponnesian War. Aristotle came later. Politically, however, the city-states were increasingly vulnerable. To the north, Macedon rose under King Philip II. Macedon had long been seen by southern Greeks as semi-barbaric and relatively minor. But Philip was shrewd and ambitious. He reformed the Macedonian army, introducing the long sarissa pike and more flexible phalanx tactics. He combined diplomacy with force, and he moved steadily to dominate the weakened Greek city-states. Demosthenes, the Athenian orator, warned against Philip in his Philippic speeches. But Athens and its allies could not stop him. In 338 BC, Philip won a decisive victory at Chaeronea. He defeated the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. After that, the Greek city-states, with a few exceptions, became subordinate to Philip's authority. Philip organized the League of Corinth, presenting it as Greek unity under Macedonian leadership. Greek cities kept local governments, but real power now lay with Philip, and after his assassination, with his son Alexander. Alexander the Great, educated by Aristotle, took up his father's project. In a little over a decade of campaigning, he led Greeks and Macedonians in the conquest of the Persian Empire, marching as far as India. His victories at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela toppled the Persian king Darius III. Alexander founded new cities, including Alexandria in Egypt, and spread Greek culture across a vast territory. This ushered in the Hellenistic Age, where Greek language and ideas mixed with Eastern traditions. After Alexander's early death in 323 BC, his empire fractured. The Greek world shifted toward large Hellenistic kingdoms, such as the Seleucid Empire, Ptolemaic Egypt, and Antigonid Macedon. Back in the Greek heartland, the old city-states never fully regained their former autonomy. They often became pawns within larger kingdoms. Eventually, in the 2nd century BC, Rome intervened. By 146 BC, Greece was conquered by Rome. The sack of Corinth in 146 BC is often marked as the symbolic end of Greek independence. The classical period ends with both achievement and pathos. The 5th century BC brought the height of Greek political freedom and cultural brilliance. The 4th century BC brought internal conflict and the loss of that freedom to a northern monarch, one who would also spread Greek ideas far beyond Greece itself. The Greek story does not end here. It enters a new phase under Rome, and later Byzantium. Greek culture, in turn, shaped Roman culture deeply, almost a kind of conquest in reverse. Still, as a distinct chapter, the close of the classical era is poignant. The age of small, independent, citizen-governed city-states was over. And yet, it is hard not to marvel at the concentration of genius that appeared in such a small place over such a short span. In Athens alone, over a few generations, lived Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, statesmen like Themistocles and Pericles, historians like Herodotus and Thucydides, artists, architects, and scientists. a free citizenry used to debate and public speech, likely helped fuel this creativity. The Greek willingness to question and argue, sometimes fiercely, drove intellectual progress. But that same fierce independence made lasting unity difficult. Greeks shared language, religion, and festivals, yet they remained politically divided. They united briefly against Persia. Then they turned against one another. In the end, they fell to a power that was, ironically, culturally their pupil, but politically more cohesive. By the mid-4th century BC, the curtain was falling on the era of the independent Greek city-states. Classical Greece did not collapse in a single catastrophe. Instead, its political power slowly eroded. Autonomy weakened, influence shifted, and the old city-states were gradually absorbed into larger empires. Yet this was not the end of Greece's story. In many ways, Greek culture would spread farther than ever, carried by the very transitions that ended Greek independence. In this final section, we turn to the Hellenistic Age and the Roman conquest, and we reflect on what ancient Greece handed down to the world. After Alexander the Great's death in 323 BC, his vast empire broke apart among his generals, the Diadochi. The centuries from 323 to 31 BC are known as the Hellenistic period. During this time, Greek culture spread across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East on a new scale. New kingdoms emerged. The Seleucid Empire ruled much of the Near East. The Ptolemaic kingdom controlled Egypt. The Antigonid dynasty held Macedon, among others. These were monarchies. They were often ruled by Macedonian Greek elites who encouraged Greek immigration and founded Greek-style cities. One city became especially famous, Alexandria in Egypt. It rose as a center of learning. The Library of Alexandria and the museum attracted scholars from across the world. Alexandria became a crossroads where Greek, Egyptian, and Near Eastern knowledge mixed. Science and mathematics flourished. Euclid systematized geometry in Alexandria. Archimedes in Syracuse made breakthroughs in mathematics and engineering. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with impressive accuracy. Hipparchus advanced astronomy. Philosophy continued as well. Stoics, Epicureans, and skeptics offered guidance for how to live in a world of change. Hellenistic art also took on a new tone. It often became more emotional and dramatic. Think of the Laocoon sculpture, filled with strain and motion, or the Venus de Milo, graceful and idealized. Politically, however, the Hellenistic world was different from the classical age. This was a world of kings and large armies, not citizen militias and direct democracy. The Polis did not vanish. Athens, Sparta, and many other cities still existed. Some kept internal self-government, but most now lived under the influence or control of Hellenistic monarchs. Athens itself became less a military power and more an intellectual center. In this period, it could feel like a university town. Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum continued, and students still came to study. The final end of Greek political independence came through Rome. Rome had already absorbed southern Italy and Sicily, including regions shaped by Greek colonies, by the 3rd century BC. Over time, Roman power moved east. Through the Macedonian Wars, Rome defeated the Antigonid kingdom. Philip V fought Rome. Then Perseus fought Rome. By 146 BC, Rome had effectively taken over Macedon and Greece. Corinth was destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC. For many, it became a symbolic end to Greek resistance. The last great Hellenistic kingdom was Ptolemaic Egypt. It fell to Rome in 30 BC, after the defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. From then on, Greece lived under Roman rule. Yet Rome often treated Greece with a certain respect, as a land of ancient prestige. Wealthy Romans sent their sons to Athens to study. Some emperors admired Greek culture. Hadrian later patronized Greek cities and built monuments in Athens. One could call the Roman period the twilight of ancient Greek history. Some even place the end of antiquity much later. One famous marker is the closure of pagan philosophical schools by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in AD 529, which is sometimes treated as a symbolic end to the ancient philosophical tradition. But the fire of Greek culture did not go out. It changed form, and it was transmitted. Under Rome, Greek remained the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. New Testament Christian scriptures were written in Greek. Greek art and architecture shaped Roman taste. Greek literature was admired and imitated. The Romans adapted the Greek pantheon, equating Zeus with Jupiter, and so on. Hellenistic scholarship also continued under Roman rule. Politically, Greece faded. Culturally, it traveled. Even as the political structures of classical Greece weakened, Greek ideas spread farther than ever. One could argue that culturally, Greece did not decline at all. It expanded. Through Alexander's conquests and Rome's long dominion, Greek thought reached Syria, Persia, and Egypt. In time, it also shaped Europe's far west. Consider democracy. The Athenian assembly was a brief experiment, yet it became a concept later ages rediscovered and tried to revive in modified forms. Consider philosophy. Greek foundations shaped nearly every field of thought in the West. Logic, ethics, political theory, and natural science all leaned on Greek beginnings. Greek historians also changed how we understand the past. Herodotus and Thucydides helped define history as a discipline and an investigation, not simply a story. Greek mythology and literature offered archetypes that artists and writers reused for centuries. Greek drama provided patterns of character and plot that still feel familiar. Greek art and architecture set enduring standards. The proportions of a Doric temple or the contrapposto stance of a statue influenced builders from the Romans to neoclassical architects in Washington, D.C., and beyond. The Parthenon still stands as a symbol of ideal beauty. Greek drama remains a model for storytelling. Even Greek language had a long afterlife. The New Testament was written in Greek. Byzantine civilization was Greek-speaking for another 1,000 years after Rome's fall. Greek roots still shape modern scientific and technical vocabulary. Words like astronomy, biology, politics, philosophy, these are Greek. English, too, is full of Greek-derived terms, from democracy to atom to encyclopedia. If we step back and look at the arc of ancient Greece, from early villages to classical splendor, and then the loss of independence, we are reminded that history is unpredictable. The Greeks themselves were deeply aware of fortune, Tyche. City-states rose and fell. Heroes met tragic ends. Golden ages gave way to decline. Yet through these shifts, a core spirit persisted, a love of beauty, knowledge, and excellence. The Greeks had a word for this, arete. It means virtue, or excellence in fulfilling one's potential. That spirit may be Greece's greatest legacy. It is one reason ancient Greece still feels endlessly fascinating and inspiring. We began with images of Greeks debating under open skies and warriors fighting at Troy's gates. As we conclude, we can still see echoes of Greece in our own world. We admire the questioning spirit of Socrates. We thrill to stories like Leonidas at Thermopylae. We build public buildings with Greek columns to suggest democracy, reason, and justice. Ancient Greece may survive now mostly in ruins and texts, yet it remains alive in imagination and institutions. The history of ancient Greece is a story of remarkable highs and sobering lows. It shows human potential for greatness in thought and art. It also shows human tendencies toward conflict and hubris. It feels fitting to end with a gentle reflection rather than a hard conclusion. Greece's story flows into Rome, and then into the broader story of Western civilization. Whenever we engage in rational inquiry, whenever we value freedom of speech, whenever we pursue education, strive in sport, or create art for its own sake, we are, in a way, carrying forward a torch first lit by those long-ago Greeks. And so, the legacy of ancient Greece remains open-ended. It is an ongoing dialogue across time, inviting each new generation to listen, to learn, and perhaps to add its own chapter to the ever-continuing story of human civilization. And that brings our story to a close for tonight. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed it, a like is always appreciated, and if you'd like to hear more, you're welcome to subscribe. Until then, rest easy. Good night.